So as we just heard in Luke's gospel lesson, according to Luke, the story of Jesus begins not with angels singing, not with shepherds in a field, not with a shining star or wandering magi. The story of Jesus begins, according to Luke, with a time stamp, a historical marker, a reminder of what the world was actually like. Luke writes, "In the days of King Herod," and these are not comforting words. They're not nostalgic. They don't sound much like Christmas at all, do they? But they are the beginning of the gospel, and they matter. Because Advent is not a season that is built upon sentimentality. It's a season that is built on honesty. Honesty about the world as it is. Honesty about the fears that we carry. And honesty about the God who enters into our world and meets our fears with hope. So let's begin the way that Luke begins. Let's step into the world as it really was in the days of King Herod. Now, we tend to imagine the world of Jesus' birth through the filter of things like children's pageants and greeting cards. We think of a peaceful hillside and a friendly innkeeper and a soft, glowing manger scene with happy farm animals leaning in at just the right angle. But that's not the world that Jesus was born into, not even close. The world into which Jesus came was shaped by violence, fear, and Roman occupation. The Romans declared something called Pax Romana, or the peace of Rome. But for the Jewish people, it was peace that was maintained by a sword. It was peace that was built on the backs of oppressed people. One ancient historian reports that Rome crucified 2,000 people from one city, one Jewish city. They crucified 2,000 people in one punitive sweep. 2,000 human lives because they dared to resist the empire. And this happened right around the time that Jesus was born, about a half a day's walk from Nazareth, Jesus' hometown. So just imagine growing up in a world where the empire lined the roads with crucified bodies simply to make a point. And imagine the fear that would settle into the very bones of those families who lived in that area. Rome was known for taking anything it needed or wanted. Rome took food from the people when it wanted food. Rome took livestock when it needed livestock. Roman soldiers even took women when they wanted women. The world was unstable, unpredictable, and dangerous. For ordinary Jewish families, simple survival was the primary goal. Daily life meant carrying the weight of political oppression, economic disparity, and constant threat. And in many ways, it was a world that is not so different from our own today. A world where fear could be found anywhere. A world in desperate need of some good news, in need of a savior. To begin his gospel account, Luke does not say, in the time of a kind king, or in the time of the time of a peaceful ruler. No. He says, in the time of King Herod. And so it made me wonder what was so significant about this time. So I spent some time this week learning as much as I could about King Herod. And the more that I learned, the more I understood that Luke chose these words intentionally, because Herod was not simply a footnote. He was a force. Herod was born into a powerful Jewish family, and he rose to prominence quickly. He became the governor of the area of Galilee by the age 25. And to maintain his power, he aligned himself with the foreign occupying forces of Rome. And he taxed his own people and funneled their money into the very empire that oppressed all of the people. And his loyalty to Rome paid off. Antony and Cleopatra named Herod the King of the Jews. It was a political title that was both ironic and inflammatory. And once he held that title, he did everything he could to keep it. He filled positions of power with his cronies and his relatives. He ignored the traditional ways of people stepping into these positions of power. He executed 45 of Jerusalem's aristocrats because they had supported his rival. He confiscated the property of those that he had eliminated simply to pay off his own debts. He even killed members of his own family. He killed one of his wives. He had a will that would indicate his preferences for which of his sons would follow him in power. And he changed that will 7 different times, and it created tremendous strife among his sons, so much so that Herod ended up killing 5 of his sons. He projected strength because internally he was terrified of losing power and control. Herod built massive structures, palaces, amphitheaters, marketplaces, even entire cities, all to give the illusion of stability and grandeur. His most ambitious project may have been the expansion of the Jewish temple. And yes, it provided jobs, but it also served as a monument to his ego. Herod wanted to be remembered for his greatness, but he is remembered instead for his fear. Because fear, when left unchecked, becomes tyranny. Fear, when given power, becomes violence. The New Testament scholar Aubrey Hendricks writes that maintenance of Herod's position rested on currying Roman favor by funneling wealth to Rome and resorting to unspeakable brutality to thwart his own people's quest for freedom. And this environment of callous economic exploitation and homicidal repression is the dangerously volatile setting into which Jesus was born. In other words, Jesus was born in a fearful time. And that truth matters to us even today. This Advent, we're asking a question that sits beneath the entire Advent story, and it sits beneath our own lives. What do you fear? And that's a vulnerable question, isn't it? It's an honest question. And it's a deeply spiritual question. Not because fear is something to be ashamed of or something that we should pretend that we don't feel, but because fear is part of what it means to be human. Fear tells us that something matters to us. Fear reveals our longings, our hopes, our grief, our vulnerability. So our goal in this series is not to amplify the fear that overwhelms us or to shame us for feeling fear. Our goal is to become more compassionate toward our fears, to understand them, to name them, and to invite God to meet us in our fear. Because Advent is full of fear. Mary was afraid. Joseph was afraid. The shepherds were afraid. Zechariah, as we'll see in a moment, was afraid. And at every turn, an angel appears with a message. Do not be afraid. Not because the world isn't scary, not because everything is fine, but because God is near. So this season we'll look honestly at fear, not to dwell in it, but to move through it. We'll sit with that question, what do you fear? So that we can hear more clearly God's whisper of hope. Because as one writer put it, if you ask me today what I fear, she said, I would say this: I fear a world without hope. Now, this morning's scripture passage introduces us to Zechariah and Elizabeth, and they were faithful people living in fearful times. They carried both personal and communal grief. They had no child, which was something that was viewed in their culture not simply as something to be disappointed in, but it was something to be ashamed of. They had prayed for years and nothing had happened. They were older now, and hope felt distant. And all the while, they lived under Herod's rule, under Rome's occupation, under the weight of national despair. Hope felt unrealistic. Fear was what felt normal. And then one day, when Zechariah was performing his priestly duties in the temple, something happened. The angel Gabriel appeared, and Luke tells us that Zechariah was terrified. And the Greek word that is used there is the Greek word tarasso, which means to be shaken, to be agitated, to be deeply disturbed. And so this fear wasn't simply a jump scare. It was deep soul fear. It was fear that was rooted in years of disappointment and longing. And what does the angel Gabriel say? Do not be afraid, Zechariah, for your prayers have been heard. And that's the moment that Advent begins. Not with a star, not with a manger, but with fear acknowledged and hope spoken. Gabriel does not shame Zechariah for being afraid. He does not tell him to just get over it, Zechariah. He does not dismiss the reality of his world. He simply says, your fear is real, Zechariah, but your fear is not the whole story, for God has heard you. And this is the good news of Advent. Not that fear disappears, but that God steps into a fearful world and speaks words of hope. Hope is not mere optimism. Hope is not just wishful thinking. Hope is not pretending like everything is fine. Hope is the belief that God is present even when things are not fine. Hope is sitting in the dark and still expecting the dawn to come. Hope is Zechariah and Elizabeth praying year after year, not because they saw signs of change, but because they trusted God enough to keep praying anyway. Hope is what carried the people of Israel through exile and occupation and despair. It's what carried Mary when she said, "Let it be with me according to your word." Hope is what carried Joseph when he chose faith over fear. It's what carried the shepherds as they ran toward that manger. And today, on the first Sunday of Advent, we lit the candle of hope. Not because life is simple or because the world is calm, but because hope is stubborn. Hope endures. Hope is the light that refuses to go out. Hope is the promise that God is near. Hope is the first word of Advent, and in a fearful world, hope is a radical act. Now, we are not living in the times of King Herod, but we are living in what some have called Herodian times. We live in a world that is marked with conflict and division, violence, uncertainty, and leaders who use fear as a political weapon and who put their own pursuit of power over the needs of the people. So we turn to the question that will guide us throughout this Advent. What do you fear? Maybe you fear for your children or grandchildren, what kind of world they're inheriting. Maybe you fear for our nation, how divided we've become. Maybe you fear illness, aging, loss, loneliness. Maybe you fear financial instability or job insecurity. Maybe you fear the violence that erupts without warning in our schools or grocery stores or concerts or even places of worship. Maybe you fear being authentically who you are because you don't know what others will say or do to you or about you. Maybe you fear climate disaster or global conflict or political extremism. Maybe you fear the erosion of compassion or justice or civility or truth. Maybe you fear vulnerability or that your prayers are going unanswered. Friends, we live in a time where fear can be found everywhere, so much so that we can become numb to it. Fear hums beneath our conversations. It shapes our decisions. It dictates our pace of life, our posture towards strangers, our expectations for the future. Fear can and does divide us. Fear can exhaust us. Fear can shrink our world down to the size of our anxieties. But what if fear is not the enemy? What if fear is something that we can learn from? What if fear is the place where God chooses to speak? Trauma theologians tell us that fear often hides our longings, our deep yearning for something better, something safer, something whole, something healed. And that longing is holy. And Advent invites us to name it, to say out loud, God, this is what I fear. This is where I ache. This is what I long for. Because when we name our fear, God can meet us there. And as the angel said, your prayer has been heard. So where is our hope today? Hope begins with remembering that God enters into the fearful places. Jesus was born in the days of King Herod, not in a golden age, not in a peaceful era, but in a time when people were afraid. And if God entered that world, God will enter ours. Hope continues because God hears us before we even know how to pray. Gabriel said to Zechariah, your prayer has been heard, long before Zechariah saw any sign. Long before he felt the stirring of possibility, God had already been listening to him, and God listens still. Hope grows because God chooses ordinary people. God chose Zechariah and Elizabeth, an older couple with no social power. God chose Mary, a poor teenage girl. God chose Joseph, a humble carpenter. God chose shepherds, nobodies on a hillside. God chose Bethlehem, a town on the margins. God chooses the overlooked, the weary, the frightened, and God chooses us. Hope transforms because it leads to action. Hope is not passive. Hope is not soft. Hope rearranges our priorities. Hope helps us resist despair. Hope invites us to be brave and to be compassionate, to be generous and kind. Hope interrupts the cycle of fear. Hope moves us toward people instead of away from them. Hope builds bridges, opens tables, and creates community. Hope endures because God is with us. Emmanuel, God with us. It's not just a poetic idea, it is the very heartbeat of Advent. God is with us in the doctor's office. God is with us in the quiet of our sleepless nights. God is with us in the hospital waiting room. God is with us in our divided families and our divided nation. God is with us when grief is sharp and when loneliness weighs heavy. God is with us in the uncertainty of what comes next. God is with us in Herodian times. God is with us today. God is with us. And that is enough. When we remove the brutality of the Christmas story, the danger and the displacement and the fear, we run the risk of losing the power of the story. We need the unsanitized truth of Advent. We need the raw, real story of a God who enters the world not in the safety of a palace, but in the vulnerability of a stable. Because there are still mothers today, like Mary, who cradle their children and fear for their safety. There are still families today, like the Holy Family, who are forced to flee for their survival. There are still people today who are living under unjust systems, political cruelty, and violence. And Advent asks us, how will we be people of hope in such a world? Not sentimentality, not denial, not avoidance, but hope. Hope that is rooted in God's presence, God's justice, God's promise, God's love. In the end, the Advent story is not about escape. It's about incarnation. It's about a God who comes close, a God who chooses the margins, a God who embraces vulnerability, a God who refuses to let fear have the last word. So I ask once again, what do you fear? And just as importantly, what do you hope for? Because somewhere deep beneath your fear lives a longing for healing or for peace or for reconciliation or for possibility, a longing for joy, a longing for God. Zechariah and Elizabeth longed for a child. Israel longed for a Messiah. And God heard them. And God hears you too. God hears those fears that you dare not say aloud. God hears the ache that is beneath your prayers. God hears the longing in your silence, and God steps into that place with hope. This is Advent. This is the season where hope breaks in, quietly, unexpectedly, stubbornly. In the time of King Herod, in the time of political turmoil, in the time of uncertainty, in the time of fear. Advent is the promise that fear does not get the last word, but that God does. Hope does. So on this first Sunday of Advent, we light this candle of hope. Not because the world is calm, but because the world is not. Not because fear is gone, but because hope is stronger. Hope does not deny reality. Hope defies it. Hope whispers, God is here. Hope says, your prayer has been answered, or your prayer has been heard. Hope declares, do not be afraid. In the days of King Herod, God brought hope into the world. And in our time, whatever fears we face, whatever uncertainty lies ahead, God brings hope still. So may we name our fears honestly. May we hold our longings tenderly. May we watch for the light faithfully. And may we trust, with everything in us, may we trust that God is near. Thanks be to God for that gift.